Nation.
It's 2 o'clock and we start this hour with a big story today. Bill Cosby, the comedian once known as America's dad, is now a free man. This is a new video of Cosby arriving home in Pennsylvania. The 83-year-old was serving a 3 to 10-year sentence after he was convicted of drugging and molesting a Temple University employee at his suburban estate back in 2004. Now, he was charged in late 2015 when a trial judge had allowed a number of other accusers to testify at Cosby's retrial. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that testimony tainted the trial and then overturned the conviction. Cosby's attorney says she is thrilled about that decision.
So listen, I think the Me Too movement has done a number of wonderful things, but our courtrooms are no place for hashtag movements and this type of emotional response. People are entitled to draw conclusions in the world outside the courtroom about people's guilt or innocence or whether they're good or they're bad, all those things. But in the courtroom, we have to be bound by the Constitution. What I am happy to see is that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was impervious to those types of public pressure, and they gave a result that was courageous. Maybe not popular, but courageous, and in the end protected all of our constitutional guarantees.
And this is a tweet by Cosby's TV wife, Felicia Rashad. She wrote, quote, "A terrible wrong is righted, a miscarriage of justice is corrected." An actor and Me Too activist Amber Tamblyn tweeting, quote, "I personally know women who this man drugged and raped while unconscious. Shame on the court and this decision." Now, the ruling by Pennsylvania's Supreme Court is raising a lot of questions, and to better help us understand what led to all this, we're joined by attorney Steve Clark. Steve, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you for having me.
What led the court to overturn the conviction? Was it simply because there were, too many character witnesses?
No, that really wasn't the issue for the court. What the court said, and you need to take a step back to 2005, that Bill Cosby was investigated by this DA's office for this very same conduct. And the DA's office made a public statement at that time: we are not going to prosecute you. We don't have enough evidence. And they sent the signal to Bill Cosby and his defense team that he was not going to get prosecuted, because they wanted to help the victim in her civil case. And so what Bill Cosby says is that I relied back on that statement in 2005, and I gave very detailed testimony during 4 depositions in the civil case, which were very problematic for him criminally. He did not take the 5th because he relied on the statements in 2005 from the prosecution. And yet now, fast forward 10 years later, Bill Cosby goes from being the most admired man in America to the most despised man in America. And these accusers are coming out against him. And a new DA in that same county said, well, there was nothing in writing back in 2005. We are going to prosecute you, and we're going to use that deposition testimony against you. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court addressed the number of accusers' issues, but they said we don't have to get to that, because he should have been able to rely on the statements from the DA's office in 2005. He was immune from prosecution. He relied on those statements. And that's what the court said. And they went forward and said, not only are we going to overturn this conviction, you can't try him again and not use the deposition. So huge win for Bill Cosby today. He's a free man. He cannot be prosecuted again for this case. But it's also an important case for criminal defense lawyers across the country who looked at this and said, this just is not fair. You made representations to the client that you would not prosecute, and you completely changed based on political and social situations at the time. And a new DA came in and said, well, we're not bound by that. We're going to go ahead and prosecute you. And they said that violated his due process rights. He would have never testified in that deposition, and therefore this was an unfair prosecution. But it is not a vindication for Mr. Cosby. He was, so that is an important point here as well. No one is saying he's innocent. What they're saying is he shouldn't have been prosecuted. 10 years later based on those initial statements by the DA.
Now, this DA said that we don't have enough evidence to prosecute. They weren't granting him immunity per se. So if he's giving statements on the record in a deposition, those statements in some settings, outside of this particular case, statements in a deposition can be used against a person. Was it a mistake on the prosecutor's part? Is that something that prosecutors across the country now have to worry about? That if they make a statement now saying that we won't prosecute because we don't have evidence, but then if later they feel that there is evidence, they can't later prosecute because of a statement they previously made? I mean, it seems a little bizarre that a ruling comes down to overturn a conviction because of a statement that Cosby was immune from prosecution, but that at that time there was not enough to prosecute him with. But then later on, there's statements made under penalty of perjury and on the record.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I think there's a lesson to be learned here that as a criminal defense lawyer, you want to make sure that you get an immunity agreement in writing, because this was a very precarious scenario. The fact that they relied on these public statements and press releases and further statements that they weren't going to prosecute him. But what makes this different than a lot of other cases, DAs change their mind all the time and they get more evidence and they make a different charging decision. But what was different here is that they represented to the Cosby team, we're not going to prosecute you. You can't take the fifth in the depot because we want to help the victim and get her a civil judgment. And in reliance on that, rather than take the Fifth Amendment, he testified in the deposition, and later the DA used that deposition testimony against him. This happens all the time where people are prosecuted and sued at the same time, and that is usually when a defendant will take the fifth during a depo to avoid this kind of problem. But he was not allowed to do that because the civil court said, you can't be prosecuted. You're relying on the statements of this DA. And there was a big fight between the new DA and the old DA because this wasn't reduced to writing. And I think you made a great point about that. And there was a lot of ambiguity. And as a result of that ambiguity, Bill Cosby spent 3 years in jail fighting this case. Certainly if this had been a different decision at the outset, he never would have been prosecuted in the first place.
Now, in the eyes of the court, he is now a free man. In the eyes of the public, a very, very different story. There is obviously going to be, if not already, a lot of resistance, a lot of blowback from the Me Too community, from just people really all across the country and around the world that kind of followed Bill Cosby's case. Where do you think, he stands? He's now a free man. He can now, go around and take care of his day-to-day activities. I know he is legally blind, but he's going to be out in the public. What happens now?
Well, I don't see that the public perception of him changes. I think that the number of accusers across the country has painted a very troubling picture of Mr. Cosby, and nothing that the court did today changes that. This was not saying that Bill Cosby is innocent of these charges, and far from it. What it does say, though, is that he should be able to rely on his due process rights, that the prosecutor made these statements, I relied on him that I wouldn't be prosecuted, and I relied to my detriment. And that's what the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania said, that there was just too much here. You can't change the rules on somebody like this. And that was why they overturned the case, not because Bill Cosby was innocent. So I don't think the public perception of him changes one bit. Even in custody, Bill Cosby refused to show remorse. He refused to participate in counseling. So nothing he's done since then, I think, is changing the public perception of him and what he's been accused of doing, not just to the victim in this case, but to women throughout the country and across his career.
Now, Steve, my last question for you is typically we see cases like this where this may be something that has happened in Pennsylvania before. It's not something that's been publicized much if it's happened in many other states. Do you think a ruling like this by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court could open the floodgates to, other cases with defendants in similar positions as Cosby himself?
I do, and I think there was a tremendous lesson to be learned for those who practice criminal law. that you want to get everything in writing. Had there been a written immunity agreement between Cosby's team and the DA's office signed off on a judge, you wouldn't have had this ambiguity. And I think that's a real takeaway here, that if you're going to rely on something like this, get it in writing. I think that's the takeaway for the criminal defense community. You need to be careful because you may have a good relationship with a DA at one time, but a new DA comes in, the changing political climate and the Me Too movement comes forward, and that second DA is going to say, I'm not relying on that. I'm not bound by that. We think we can make our case, and they did make their case. So there's an important part here to Mr. Cosby's case, but I think there's also a very important practical aspect to this case for people practicing criminal law. And I think the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did a 79-page opinion explaining this because they knew they were going to take a lot of heat letting him out of custody after he's been convicted, and particularly since his conduct in custody wasn't particularly good.
A very, very important message. One thing I do remember from my time litigating is any promise that you're getting from opposing counsel that you are relying on, you better get it in writing. Well, Steve, we really appreciate you.
That's the takeaway.
There you go.
That's the takeaway here. And it's an important lesson to be learned. And I think the defense of Bill Cosby is breathing a very big sigh of relief tonight that, in fact, the Supreme Court went their way.
His defense counsel, he himself, along with his family, no doubt. Well, Steve, we really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
And coming up at 2:30, Attorney Gloria Allred, who represented 33 of Bill Cosby's accusers, is going to be speaking on his release from prison and overturned conviction. We'll bring that to you as soon as it begins right here on Chron On, so be sure to stay with us to get that.